for attending Save Against Fear, making this weekend just a fantastic first foray into the realm of online convention, and just a wonderful place for people to meet and share this love of gaming, and specifically all the professionals who've been coming and enjoying the panels. An additional thank you to everyone directly. I know I've thanked you probably through inordinate amounts of emails, but thank you for making time for this space and this very important topic that I know is very near and dear to all of you. So the level of passion, the level of investment, engagement, not to use like a weird phrase, but you're pretty much like, this panel is like the hot ticket item of the weekend. Like when people say, if there's a panel I cannot miss, it is this panel. And I think that that definitely speaks to a lot of the work that everyone has done for advancing the importance of consent overall, and in all of the different realms that everyone has done that. So I personally thank you again for helping make SAVE continue to be as special as it is and will be. And thank you for being here and doing this. I always much thanks.
Thank you, Jack.
All right.
For being so passionate about all this. This is great.
Yeah, I well up at least 5 times a day during SAVE, but it's beautiful. So
I just like that this year, because we are virtual, we can have such a diverse cast of folks talking that we can't have when you're having to pay for everybody to come to the show, you know?
Yeah, we're actually looking at the possibility of, for future saves, having an online component as well, that folks can watch, and maybe even having, like, you know, when the panels are running, having an area where we're broadcasting it so people even at the con can come and attend in person while there is still, and, you know, we can type so many different tech options. But you're right, it has definitely increased who we have and what we can do. And just as a note, unfortunately, our panel at 7 o'clock had no one signed up, so we canceled it. What that does mean is, if you need to go over because of the length or strength of the conversation, please do not feel in any way that you will be bumping up against someone else in the schedule.
Okay.
Okay? So the internet is your oyster. And again, thank you. And now I will remove myself to continue on with the...
I have a question. Sorry. Can those who attend see our chat, or is that just for panelists?
If you look at where it says to all panelists and attendees, you can actually change that. So you can send a message like just to me, or you can send a message to all the panelists where the attendees can't see it. Yep. So yeah, that's totally fine.
Thank you.
Of course.
All right. Awesome. So, okay, Dixie as the host, recording is going well. All right, be well, everyone. Have an excellent panel. And again, thank you for coming and be joining the Bodoniverse.
Hi, Jack.
All right, be well.
All right, so hi, I'm Dixie Cochran. I'm your moderator. I'm an in-house developer at Onyx Path Publishing. I'm also an editor that does freelance all over the RPG industry. Jax I know very well. Everybody else I kind of vaguely know from the internet, or the fact that, you know, John, we cite your mechanic in like all of our books. So I'm familiar with your name. We did have a panel earlier, for those who missed it, that was about safety tools in gaming specifically. So we talked mostly there about consent forms, we talked about X cards, about lines and veils. I'm sure we're going to cover some of that here too. But what I'd like to do during this talk is talk more about why consent is important and what it actually brings to your table and how it makes your game better in the long run. So we have the tools panel, which we can still mention, obviously. We tried really hard not to get into the concept of consent and why it's important in that one, so we wouldn't have 2 panels that were the exact same. So let's go around, let's introduce folks, and talk a little bit about what you do. So Jax, you want to start us off?
Yes, I will start us off. Hi, I'm Jacqueline Brick, otherwise known as Jax. My pronouns are she, her. I do a lot of safety writing for Onyx Path and for some other games as well. I'm also an award-winning horror writer and currently the English editor for Cult Divinity Lost.
Which definitely needs safety tools. Sarah?
Hi, I'm Sarah Lynne Bowman. I am a scholar. I've done some game design and also have worked on safety design, particularly creating consent mechanics and scripts for LARP. So I'm very, very happy that we're talking about this topic. I'm excited to be here.
Me too. Shauna, I'm just going around the counterclockwise on my screen.
Hi, I'm Shauna Germain. I'm co-owner of Monty Cook Games. I'm also an erotica writer. I write nonfiction about sex, which of course has its own set of consent stuff. I'm the co-creator of No Thank You Evil and the co-creator of a consent form that we put out from Monty Cook Games. Most of the time I spend my life writing, so this is a topic that's pretty near and dear to me as well.
Yeah, we actually linked the consent form earlier in our earlier panel, so we'll probably link it again at some point here in case anybody wants it, because we've got more folks in this one, it looks like. And John, last but not least.
Great. This is John Stavropoulos. Don't worry about pronouncing or spelling my last name. In my real life, I work as an executive director of product and design. Specifically, my last major project was the Department of Child Services, specifically creating systems to help reduce trauma in some of the most vulnerable children in the United States of America. In games, I primarily have done design, safety tool design. I designed the X card, as well as done consulting with a wide variety of games, literally hundreds of games, and as well as running conferences. I think we've run in New York City about 26 conferences where we've implemented a lot of the tools that we all talk about as like a baseline standard.
Very cool. And just as a note to anybody watching, Shauna has warned us that she has a very big storm going on where she is. So if she pops off the call at any point, we apologize. So we'll try to get her to talk as much as we can at the beginning, just in case. Yeah, so what I want to do is kind of just start with like why people think consent is important in games and what they mean by that when we say consent. Like why, you know what I'm asking. I'm sorry. I'm tired. but yeah, so like, what do you mean when you say consent and why is it important at your table? And we can just start with whoever. It's like a round table situation. Anyone? Shauna, you talk. I'm just going to pick somebody if nobody answers me.
That's a difficult part of people who understand consent is no one wants to step on anyone else's toes, and Zoom makes that super complicated. So thank you for picking someone, even if it was me.
It's fine. I'll just call on people. But I figured once again, if we're gonna lose you, like let's just get some of your thoughts
Fair
in
enough.
first.
So I think that not everyone knows that consent like consent forms and consent in general matters. And I think that there's two reasons for that. One is they don't understand what it is. I'm really glad that we're talking about that. And the other is that their version of fun is making people uncomfortable. And that's sort of a thing that is its own kind of issue that we as a culture could do a lot of work with and probably is outside the scope of this conversation a little bit. So for me, consent is all about empathy. And it's really the basic is, are you having fun and are you comfortable? And is this a good space for you? And so I think like if you can just keep in mind that like this idea of empathy where you are thinking about everyone else's experiences and trying to make it the most enjoyable and safe and fun for everyone is like a really easy place to kind of start with the idea of what consent is.
Jax, John, anybody? Sarah?
I can go next.
Yeah, just jump in. It's fun.
Okay, great. So why does consent matter in games? For me, I am very interested in the truth. So like if people are playing a game, I want them to let me know in any way that they're comfortable with what they want out of the game. Like I don't want anyone to feel peer pressured, etc. And as I mentioned earlier, I've run multiple conferences, both in games and outside of games. And one of the things we would always do is survey folks. So a lot of times you would hear people say one thing, but when it was an anonymous survey, or if they could add their name if they wanted, we'd hear something completely different, right? So like in the moment you hear one thing, when someone feels safe and comfortable and that there's no consequences, you hear another thing. And so for me, I really want to create that situation in every instance, especially when it comes to games.
Very cool. Yeah, definitely. Jax?
I'm just going to raise my hand if I have a thought, because I think that'll make that a lot easier.
That works. Go for it. We can go on a hand raising system.
Cool. I love a hand raising system. Consent, very useful because we don't, it's very hard to have a language for people to feel comfortable saying yes and no, especially when it's just a game, especially when it's a horror game. Something I actually talked about earlier on a TikTok video, God help me. I got into TikTok. That's not relevant. Something I talked about is I mostly write horror, and there's a difference, and there's a very obvious difference when somebody is writing horror to connect with people versus when somebody is writing horror to harm people. And the best horror comes when you're writing it with love and you're writing it with the idea that this is a story of someone's trauma. This is a story of someone's experience with pain, but it shouldn't be the story of your player's experience with pain, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So being able to get people's consent, being able to get people's buy-in, being able to have people say, yes, I want you to frighten and affect me in these ways, means you can lean really hard into that and have much more beautiful, powerful games than if you're just going, and then worm made out of spiders crawls up your butt. No, you don't get to say yes. You don't get to say no or yes to that. It's happening because your character is going to be violated because I say so.
Yeah.
And it's just not, it's not as powerful.
Yeah, we talked a little in the earlier panel about GMs inflicting things on people versus telling stories with them. And that's a huge difference.
And if you've seen anything on the internet about GMs like, I'm going to make my players cry. If they don't follow this plan, I'm going to, hurt their characters. I hate that shit.
Same. John, your thought?
Yeah, building on what Jax was saying, I believe it was the Fate Horror Toolkit that had a really cool line in it that said, horror is not an excuse to be horrible.
Yeah, exactly. You're not there to terrorize your players unless it's with their full and enthusiastic consent because they want to be terrorized, because that's a different thing entirely. Sarah, did you have any thoughts on what we mean by consent and what that looks like at your table?
Well, I'm going to answer this kind of big picture.
Go for it.
Because I don't think that we really have a sense of consent as humans. We live in a non-consensual society. We're forced to do non-consensual things throughout most of our lives, and we are encouraged to behave in ways that are non-consensual. Just take, for example, the way that most people are taught dating rituals, and how to misread signals and how to push and how to, get people in an altered state so that so they're more pliable and things like that. And that's all normative. Like, that's not even predatory necessarily. That is what is taught as the way things are. And so it's actually quite a revolution to even talk about consent in the way that we're talking about it. And I think that in games, the way that has shifted is games used to be about, well, if the dice say so, or if the GM says so, it happens. And anybody can do anything. And you're just, if it's plausible in the fiction, then it can happen. And of course, that leaves a lot of people feeling deeply uncomfortable with certain kinds of content. And it doesn't always have to be sexual in nature. It can be other kinds of content as well. But certainly that's been a big area, especially for people of different genders at the table. And so, us having this conversation is saying, well, yeah, technically within the rules of a game system, that might be plausible, but it's not necessarily playable for the people that are sitting at the table. So what if we could create an experience where people are able to calibrate with each other what feels comfortable and what doesn't? And there's some role play theory that I'd like to get into later around that, but that's basically what I mean by consent.
Yeah, totally. It's kind of funny. I think I'm so used to being in my little bubble with my friends that I'm just like, yeah, consent's like a thing that we all care about now, and forget that in the wider world, it's maybe not. Because I'm so, like, I do hang out with people like Jax and, all folks that talk about these sorts of things. And so, like, in my brain, I'm like, yeah, consent culture, enthusiastic consent, like, don't touch people without their consent, that kind of stuff. But then I go to cons and I'm forcibly reminded that some people think that they can just do whatever. That's not fun. So yeah, doing the big picture look at it is really good. I do want to talk a little bit. I said we were going to go like too deep into it, but I do talk a little bit about some of the consent tools and just how to use them and why they're important, or safety and consent tools. So if we want to talk about like consent forms, we're going to talk about lines and veils, the X card, just like a little tiny primer on them. John, I'm going to call on you.
Sure.
No one raises their hand, they just pick a person.
Sounds great. I'm not going to talk about the X card, so anybody else feel free. I'm going to talk about Monte Cook Games Consent in Gaming. I believe that's the name of the PDF that's free for anyone to download. It has a survey tool in it that I think is amazing. So for example, you could survey your players even in advance of a session 0. Session 0 is another tool I would recommend. Meeting together, discussing what your group as a whole wants or doesn't want from a game. The survey in Consent in Gaming lets you get into a very granular sense and a very non-pressured sense what sort of things people are excited about, what they are less excited about. It's just fantastic for clear communication, and I'm a big fan.
Mm-hmm. And I do realize that the tools themselves are not the answer, that it's all about the culture and how we build that. We'll definitely get onto that in a little bit, but just like I said, a brief primer for anyone who is not as familiar with them watching this talk. Yes, Jax?
So probably my favorite collection of tools, one in any this year. It is Kiana Shaw and Lauren Bryant Monk's Tabletop RPG Safety Toolkit, which you can get on Google Docs for free. And it has a lot of really wonderful stuff like Stars and Wishes, Roses and Thorns, some stuff I hadn't even heard of before. And having all of that in one place and having these two women who are just collecting and archiving all of these safety tools in one place as an easy reference is actually very deserving of an ENnie, especially because the toolkit is free and they're doing all this labor for free. And that's going above and beyond in a lot of ways. And you should all check it out.
I was trying to look it up real fast so I could link it in there, but I'll get it in a minute.
I'll link it, don't worry about it.
Okay, yeah, just do it to all panelists and attendees. Thanks. Shauna, or Sarah, you got your hand, yay.
So I'd like to highlight two things. The first is the OK check-in, and there's different versions of that out there. Some people might have a timeout and check in with people more informally. Some people might have like a hand signal, like an O or something like that. And then a person does the thumbs up or the thumbs down or so. And this is a way to gauge what a player's emotional state is like, even when it's not necessarily clear. So if they're having a very emotive experience, a very cathartic experience, or they seem really disturbed or uncomfortable, they may be just role-playing really, really well and really loving it on the inside, or they may be deeply unhappy and uncomfortable. So it's a way to kind of normalize stopping game and checking in with each other to say, you know, are you really okay? And sometimes a player may not know the answer to that question. So it also allows them time to pause and say, am I okay? That's a good question, you know? Because sometimes when we're in the middle of play, we might think something is all right, but actually we were triggered 10 minutes ago, and other people can see those symptoms, but we can't. So I really want to normalize check-ins at the table, and also just consent negotiations, like actually just straight up asking someone, are you comfortable with a romantic plot line during this one shot? Is that something that you're comfortable with? And allowing them to say yes or no, so that they're not forced into this uncomfortable dynamic that doesn't feel good. And that's an iterative sort of consent negotiation. So checking back in and saying, is this still okay? Because what might have been okay an hour ago may not be okay now. So.
Yeah, no, that's a really common one with me. Like I'm not flirty, I get very awkward. And so every time someone's like, romance, I'm like, nope. If all my characters have to be canonically asexual, that's okay. Like, I'm just not into this in games. I like it in real life with my boyfriend, personally. Shauna, did you have any specific tools you wanted to call out?
I kind of, yes and no. I kind of want to talk about one of the things that I love about the tools, sort of coming from a sideways perspective, is that I think in the past, even with tools that we had, they were very geared toward the GM. It was all the GM's responsibility to like check in and run things and plan a session 0 and, you know, perform aftercare, which is sort of the like space that you have after a game where you just say, hey, how are you doing? Is everybody okay? And I think one of the things I love about the new tools that we're seeing is that they're involving the group, the whole party in really cool and interesting ways. They're putting a lot more of responsibility, but also power in the hands of the players to be the ones to interact, so that it's not entirely the GM's responsibility, because that's actually a lot, right? You're already GMing and like, and I think it works so much better when it's an interaction of sort of less hierarchical power, where everyone's kind of equal around the table and they can bring issues and things. And so sort of generally speaking, I love the advent of tools that are the tools that we're seeing that are really allowing that. It's really cool.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, there's horns outside. The other two things I wanted to shout out, just because, of course, John wouldn't mention it. The X card is a great tool. We literally have a card with an X on it on the table, and you can just poke it. If you're playing live on Discord or something like that, you could do this just to say, like, I'm not okay with what's happening right now. You know, stop it, move on, and no questions asked. That's what will happen. It will stop. It will not happen anymore. I just spilled tea all over my desk, so that's cool. The other super cool one that I like is just telling people that they can get up and walk away whenever they want. Like, open door policy at a table is super helpful. We talked a lot about that in the earlier panel, so feel free to go back and watch that. We're trying to get those on the table before we start talking about all the kind of cultural stuff. So, Sarah, in our initial emails, you had said that you like to start a lot of these panels by focusing on what safety culture is trying to solve in terms of the big picture. So you talked a little bit about that, but let's kind of talk about, like, why we do this in gaming and how this actually can relate to the rest of your life on some level. Like, I have learned more about consent since I got into gaming than I was ever taught as a child, which is weird, honestly. Like, that's not okay.
Well, first I saw John was unmuting his mic. So did you have a quick thing that you wanted to say?
Oh yeah, just is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, of course.
I just wanted to tag what Shauna was saying about spreading out authority for this topic across everyone involved, not just a central authority figure. And that was primarily the purpose of like a tool like the X card in like 2012, where we would survey folks and we would have a lot of game masters saying, here's how I run games. But then when we would receive surveys from the players, they would tell us something different. And, you know, that wasn't always malicious, right? Like, to everyone's point, you have a lot that you're doing. You have all these papers, you have screens, you're calculating math, you're rolling dice, you're trying to see what just happened. It's easy to forget things. So just anything we could do to flatten the difficulty, spread it around, and make it easy.
Totally. Yeah, it should be like a shared narrative and shared world building. Sarah?
So there's a lot of places we could go with this. From a theoretical perspective, what I've been really interested in lately is the way that gaming is an altered state and the way that we are basically lowering our vigilance that we would normally have in social situations whenever we enter into the magic circle, as it's called in game theory. So we are literally trusting other people with vulnerable parts of ourselves. You know, even just the act of role playing, even in a silly game, is taking a big social risk. And so when we decide to release our vigilance and trust with one another, it's very intimate. And what can happen is people can feel very relaxed and trusting, and then somebody crosses a boundary and all of a sudden they feel violated. And that can happen in relationships, that can happen in all sorts of situations. It doesn't necessarily mean that somebody was being meaningfully harmed or meaning to be harmful, but it is something that it's helpful to create more language around so that that harm can be mitigated and or addressed when it's happening, and people may or may not feel comfortable continuing to play. So the goal is not necessarily to keep the game going and make sure the person gets dragged along, but the goal is to make sure everybody's having an experience where they feel held in the container of the game. And so also when we play, we have this thing called alibi, which is it's not me, it's the game, it's not me, it's the character. So we have this way that we obviate responsibility from our own self through the character and through the fiction. And that's great, that's what allows us to play. But it also creates this space where people can behave in all sorts of boundary pushing ways and just pass it off onto the character, or say, I'm doing you a favor by playing this villain in this way because I'm making the conflict happen in the drama or whatever. And that person may very well think that's true, but if I didn't consent to it, and this is a real example, by the way, I said it's not fun if we're not both consenting to it. And he didn't understand that because he came from a play culture, as did I, where you didn't really have a say. And I'm talking about early vampire LARPing, you know, where people just do things to each other and you don't have a say. And so there's been a gradual shift in even that play culture, which is really great. When I say that, I particularly mean like Mind Size Society and Vampire LARPing. But it is a difficult issue when you're playing with content that is tricky, and you want to make sure that people are consenting. And some people really like to play in that edge space, and some people need a lot more support to get there. And maybe they want to get there. Or maybe they don't, and maybe that's totally valid too. Like, I'm the kind of player that tends to like to sit on the couch and have deep conversations all game, and it doesn't mean that I'm, a special snowflake. It just means that I already have a lot of emotional intensity in my life, and I don't necessarily need to take it there. So how do we create spaces where lots of different kinds of experiences are welcome and accommodated for?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like Jax has a lot of has dealt with that with all of your LARP design and horror design.
Yes. It's interesting, Sarah, that you mentioned the creating spaces for more intense play versus spaces for, less intense play, or even just sitting on the couch and having deep conversations, which can be intense in and of itself. But something I also notice is, in a lot of ways, there's this pressure to consent in certain LARP spaces, because I discussed this with a friend of mine in a mental health and LARP panel a couple of years ago, where she literally broke her ankle and was still running around doing mods all weekend because, well, you need to, you're part of this game. You need to show that you're intense. You need to do this. And when you have a culture of consent, something you need to watch out for is people using that culture to bully others into more intense scenes, because oh, well, you started this scene, are you going to take it there? Are you going to take it there? Are you going to pussy out? And this is unfortunately also because Shayna mentioned she's an erotica writer, and I have some experience in the kink scene as well, and there are spaces in that scene where I actually can't talk about kink with people because people will go full sex nerd on me and start explaining how you're not a real kinkster if you're a switch, or if you're bi, or if you're not collared, or all this other shit. And I see that same gatekeeping in nerd spaces too, with intensity, because there's this idea that if you can consent to intensity, you should consent to intensity. And then we get that whole non-consent culture that Sarah was talking about earlier creeping back in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bear and it happens.
Yeah, Sarah?
I just wanted to add that in my article, I have an article on consent and LARPing. I have a whole section called the cult. It's in the article, it's the cult, but the culture of hardcore is probably the nicer way of putting it. But it's this idea that everybody here is here for a hardcore experience, and if you're not down, you're actually ruining the experience for other people. And don't break my immersion by checking in or asking for consent.
Jax?
This is something I love saying on all panels. Immersion is a false god. Stop worshiping it. I don't think I need to explain it particularly further than that. So immersion is a false god.
John?
So I want to tag some of the things that Sarah was saying, where I feel like depending on your culture, and obviously there are many cultures all over the world and it depends on a variety of factors, but there are many cultures where not asking for consent is rewarded, right? So even in the business world, for example, you hear the phrase, instead of asking for permission, ask for forgiveness later, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, literally sometimes in some meetings, I'll hear that 3-4 times a day, right? This is just the mentality that folks have, because if you ask, someone might say no. So people are very focused on how can I get what I want? And that seems to be rewarded. So I think there's almost this retraining that needs to be done when you're moving from one space to another. And so it's difficult. They've been trained for this to be alien, even though this seems it seems like you'd want to only do something because the other person wants to do it as well.
Mm-hmm. Jax?
Yeah, pulling from that, and also because Sarah mentioned her article, how many of you saw the Brave Spaces article that was on Nordic LARP a while ago?
I feel like I did at the time because I always welcome your thoughts on such things.
Yeah, John and I had a long conversation about that when it came out, because the idea behind the article was it's stupid to practice consent mechanics because usually it feels awkward and you should be able to do it in the moment, and we should push people off the deep end into stuff that they need to experience. And I'm like, that's pouring spiders on your friend who's afraid of spiders to cure their arachnophobia. That's that same bullshit exposure therapy nonsense that you keep seeing in, well, if they just did it then they'd get over it. And like, Sarah's article I think in a lot of ways addressed that really well, because I read Sarah's article and it's actually quite good. But there's this idea there's been pushback against like stated consent, not even from like the grognard types that you expect it from, but there are people who are very into LARP scholarship who are like, well, actually safety tools are clumsy, and instead of using them, we should just redo the culture. And I'm like, how are you going to do that without a bridge?
Yeah. Shauna?
Yeah, I was going to just jump off that because I think that's such a part, it's such a two-part thing that we don't always talk about, right? So we have these consent forms and we have these tools. And the reason that we have them is because we don't have a culture that does that. It is sort of inherently. We aren't inherently taught that it's okay to hear no. We aren't inherently taught to ask if something is okay. It's part of the reason that we made it part of No Thank You Evil, was because we want kids who are young to start understanding parameters and questions like that. And to be able to hear no is such a huge problem that we have as a sort of society, and it creates a lot of the toxic masculinity and things that we could sort of break apart in terms of much larger issues. And so there's all these parts of consent that I think we don't even inherently understand sometimes. And it's something as simple, like so often people don't know the thing they're putting on someone else. It isn't necessarily malicious, right? Like we've talked about. I mean, it's even things like someone who plays their music so loudly that they're affecting all 20 people in a room. Like, that's such a small thing, and yet you're now affecting 20 people in a negative way because you didn't even think that possibly the thing that you were doing could have a negative impact on others. And I think that if we can combine that sort of empathetic thought of the thing that I am doing has an impact on other people, what is that impact with these tools, that is absolutely the sort of way we build a bridge toward all of the things that we're talking about right now.
Yeah, I'm actually really loving this whole like kind of idea that consent culture is actually empathy culture, and that's even cooler to me because I like empathy. Sarah?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the Brave Space. I was actually on the editorial board for that article, so I have seen several drafts of it. And the final draft is what we published. But I had very strong feelings about it. And part of it is this idea that if someone gets triggered or something happens, then we should trust and love each other enough to just deal with it in the moment. And while that's a beautiful idea, and ideally we have that kind of trust in our play spaces, if you're showing up to an international LARP and you don't know anybody there, and people are from different play styles and they have different norms, and some people know each other and some people don't, and some people might be from marginalized backgrounds and other people aren't, there's just so many factors there that can, I don't want to say go wrong, but can get difficult. And assuming that somebody is going to be okay with trying to fix something after they're already feeling violated is really a problematic idea. And so at the same time, it would be wonderful if we could create enough trust for that to be the case. But that is something that really takes a lot of relationship building. And so just to kind of going off what Shauna was talking about, like thinking about like, how do we build a community that has that level of trust? I don't know yet. I really don't. I mean, I've been trying for years. And one thing to consider is that safety is a perception, not a reality. So safety, there are, being safe from lions, being safe from hurricanes, whatever, there are real safety things to be considered. But there's also a sense of safety, a perception of safety.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't force that on other people. We can't just say, this is a safe space. Well, it might be safe for me, but it might not feel safe for someone else. So how do we create interactions that feel more consensual for other people? Part of that is, how do we build space for people to opt out or to not have something forced upon them if they don't want it? So it's very complicated, but yeah, there's some nuances in that particular line of thought that feel to me like, I don't want someone, it just feels like a more sophisticated version of, I don't want someone ruining my fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jax, you had your hand up?
Yeah, to Sarah's point about, I wish we could create a space where we could all trust and love each other like that. So do I, but I also have ADHD and CPTSD, and being in a space with anyone, even people I love and trust very dearly, is real hard for me, especially because I don't always pick up on unspoken norms of social interaction, and as such can come off as very intense or even very aggressive because I'm trying to show someone that I appreciate them, or I'm trying to, get to know someone better, and I don't realize that I'm coming off a little strong. And even using gaming consent tools in real life and being able to have people go, do Largo, which is slow down, to me, or being able to be like, hey, you're being a little, and it's helped me be able to feel comfortable existing in this space with this terror of knowing that I could step on somebody's toes at any moment. And I don't mean that in like an edgelord way. My brain is wired differently than a lot of other people's, and it's hard to exist in that space, and it's hard to exist in a space where somebody is like, oh, well, this is, when, somebody at the beginning of a LARP announces, oh, well, this is a safe space. I always distrust that immediately, because it's very easy to say that. But the last LARP I went to where somebody led off with, this is a safe space, wound up having 3 people trying to essentially engage in police brutality at a party as their characters, and then being like, why don't people want to play this with us? This is our empowerment fantasy. You should be able to hold space for this. Like, no, you're playing cops at a party. You're playing cops at a party when we know for a fact that, cops, all cats are beautiful. But,
I definitely said that in last night's panel, so yes.
Great. But there's this idea, again, that when people say we should love and trust our fellow LARPers enough that if something happens, we can all handle that. And this is not directed at you, Sarah. This is, again, directed at that sort of idea that we should be able to do this and we should be all working together. Even in my local LARP, I know some people who like to play harder than I do. Like, I came from a play culture where if I talked too long about my character, I'd be told to shut up because no one wanted to hear about it. Like, just because I'm friends with someone, just because I have a relationship with them, doesn't necessarily mean I love and trust them to catch me in a LARP if we haven't discussed things beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
And it's incredibly frustrating to me when people put gaming culture in this space of, oh, well, we're all friends and we're all nerds and therefore we all love and trust each other because we're all weirdo outcasts. Like, no, we're all weirdo outcasts and our trauma can bump up against each other and it's gonna hurt when it does. And we need to have stuff in place for when that happens, because otherwise we're just going to be a bunch of activated people flailing around a space and making each other's trauma worse.
Yeah. I mean, I can speak to it because Jax and I are friends, but we have definitely like butted heads before because we have different ways of coping. Like, I also have ADD. I have comorbid anxiety and depression, and I have panic attacks. And there are very few people in the world that I'd be comfortable having a panic attack in front of, and a bunch of LARPers are not that. Like, my boyfriend can sit with me while I have a panic attack. And my best friend, Laura, can watch me have a panic attack. And that's about it. Like, that's the list of people I want to be around me if I'm having a panic attack.
Like, the first time Dixie and I met, like, we were friendly, but, like, the longer a weekend goes at a convention, I get more chatty and I want more reassurance, and Dixie sort of goes into herself and doesn't really want to talk to people. And so we were
I like want to work and that's it. Like I just want to
Yeah.
work and then I want to go like hang out. Yeah.
And I was like, oh God, Dixie hates me. She's like, oh God, I think Jax thinks I hate her. So then we actually had to work that out over a meal because we were like, we don't hate each other. Okay, good. Here's how we deal with each other.
We were also raised very differently. Like just
Yes.
without any context. Like I was raised Southern politeness culture where you just don't say things because that's not cool. And I've tried to get out of that as an adult, but that's also a consent culture thing actually.
Yeah.
Is that like you just did what older people said and you acted the way they wanted you to. And if you didn't do that, then you were grounded. Which did not give me a lot of autonomy growing up. And it's a thing that I've had to learn as an adult. So does anybody else have anything they want to say
I
before
saw
we
John
move on?
raise his hand.
Oh, John, go ahead, please.
So I feel like when we're designing anything, like I don't think this is specific just to consent or cultures of care, etc. We have to keep the constraints and the reality in mind, right? So I see a lot of folks try to force things into constraints or into context that it just doesn't fit or make sense. So for example, if you're running a game at a convention, and let's say that's a 4-hour time slot, your game actually is going to be probably 2.5 hours, maybe 3 hours if you're lucky, right? Because it's a 4-hour time slot, people come in late, some people have to leave early, there's breaks, you're explaining the rules, someone's has to take a phone call, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you see folks saying, oh, I'm also going to introduce this tool and that tool and this tool. And in my perfect world, we have this app that we pull up on our phones, and we seamlessly send information back and forth, and we all have the same version of something, blah blah blah. That's just not reality, right? And I see a lot of folks with good intentions trying to design things without keeping in mind the context. And one thing that folks mention is like ADHD, and potentially as part of ADHD, although not limited to ADHD, some people have compulsive speech, right? And so in those sort of situations, they might blurt something that they didn't intend to. So if you have a tool where we say, don't do this thing, and then someone does do that thing, that doesn't mean that person's awful, right? Like that just means that we need to create something else in that context or adjust it or do something that is supportive of that person. Like we need to also be able to recover from mistakes.
Yeah, the other night, this is an example that makes perfect sense. We did all of our consent stuff for the vampire game I'm playing in right now, just a home game, like 5 of us. And everybody was kind of like, yeah, gore's fine, it's vampire, not a big deal. And one of our friends did not mention that eye stuff really bothers him. And so my character did something and he immediately was like, oh, that's my thing. And I was like, I didn't do it then. It never happened. It'll never happen again. Because I felt so bad for stepping on that thing, but it didn't get mentioned beforehand. And it wasn't until it came up in the moment that he was like, oh, that's my thing. Shit. I wouldn't say bad words on this. No, that I couldn't. But yeah, I felt awful, but I've also seen tables where he wouldn't have felt comfortable saying that. And that's what we want to create, is that culture of being able to say like, whoa, actually, this is not something I'm cool with. Let me take a step back from this, etc. Shauna?
Yeah, I was gonna, this is such a good discussion. I feel like my mind's going 100 miles an hour. So I think one of the things to sort of back up and kind of encompass this thing that we're talking about is this idea that creating consent and talking about consent and creating a consent culture, it needs to have a lot of people in it, right? And ideally it needs to have people who aren't the people of privilege, because when you come from a place of privilege, you're not thinking about that stuff, because nothing, you're not going to be put in a position where things are uncomfortable, or you're the person who is always, and privilege can mean a lot of different things in this space, right? Maybe you're the person who's super outspoken and you're always like, I'm not okay with this. And that's still a position of privilege, because you are a person who can just say, hey, I don't want this thing, right? And so we need this real diverse cast to create this kind of thing, because we talk about being on the spectrum, we talk about having depression or anxiety, we talk about all kinds of things. Introvert, extrovert. I'm a huge introvert, and if someone doesn't make space for me, I won't take that space. And it's because I'm hugely empathetic and I'm hugely introverted and I'm very, very shy and I have social anxiety. So when you combine all those things, unless a GM or a team says, here's the space in which you can talk about what you're okay to do and what you're okay to experience, I have a very hard time finding that. And so I think, one of the things that's so important, and I love seeing it here, is that we're getting this real diverse cast of people who are creating these kinds of things. There's lots of options. And so you can start having conversations around like, okay, what are the tools that work for this particular group of people? What are we going to use because it's right for us? And I think that's sort of step 2 after the tool conversation. And I love that it's happening so much.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, someone said in the chat just now, I don't have personal experience with this because I am not on the autism spectrum, but that people that are on the autism spectrum, like sometimes they have a very different relationship with how they talk to folks and consent. I have friends that are, and I definitely give them more leeway, I think, than I would folks who are neurotypical when it comes to certain things. Like I'll like kind of be like, oh wait, like don't take that the way you would take it if like my boyfriend said it to me or whatever, because they don't mean it that way, and I know they don't mean it that way. I don't know if anybody does have experience with that, because I don't want to speak to something that I have such like small experience with, but I don't know if anybody has any tips or tricks about that, and if not, that's fine, we can move on. There's a whole therapist panel where they can talk about all those things. Yes, Sarah.
I don't have autism, and I don't feel like I can speak to it that way. But I will say that what I have learned about autism is that it's very helpful to explain social rules and make them extremely clear. And that's actually very helpful in social dynamics. And so it is awkward. It's awkward for everyone to ask around consent. Even for people who've been together for years, it can sometimes be awkward. And so I think it's helpful for all of us actually to be learning these scripts. And I was involved in developing one. It was for a LARP called End of the Line, which was a vampire LARP, very visceral. It's a one shot where people were like, putting their mouths on each other's necks, and it was very physical compared to most vampire LARPs. And the reason that I felt that I needed to be involved in this was I had an experience as a player at this LARP when it was in Finland, where the rule was people were supposed to be coming slowly towards you. It's called bullet time consent. Oh, and cool. That way you can kind of move out of the way if you don't want that action. Well, first of all, that assumes that the person can read your body language, sure. Right? So that's a problem right there. Second of all, when I was in the LARP, somebody did something from behind, and it scared me. And then several of us had this same experience with this player. And I think he was trying to actually just make it really cool and immersive. I don't think there was anything that was intended to be like predatory or anything like that. But so many of us were triggered after that I felt the need to, when it was going to be run in the US especially, to figure out a way for us to have that conversation. So like, because in Finland, the play culture is so immersion focused. I mean, and the assumption is that everybody is comfortable. I was just thinking, if I had just one moment to pause and turn around and just, if he would have just checked in with me for one moment, I would have been fine. Because we have this situation when we're in character where our boundaries are actually often different than our characters. So the person I was playing was this, tough drug dealing broad, who wasn't going to be upset by whatever happened with this person, right? Because she had this very strong armored exterior. But I had this sort of double experience where she was okay with it, but I as a player wasn't, and there was no space for me to actually have that conversation. So we developed a script for the next End of the Line. We also ran it in Berlin with the script. The script is clunky, sometimes it's, most people don't get the script exactly right, but there's reasons why the script is there. And one of the reasons is there are ways that consent can be asked for that actually feels like pressure. And I think this came up earlier in the conversation. So one of the things we did is, if somebody would initiate something, we'd say like off game, sexuality. And the person would say, and if the person says that they were, yes, please. If they said no, thank you, then it's just done at that point. But if the person says, yes, please, then the initiator would actually ask them, what would you like to experience, you know? So actually it's being put, it's instead of somebody saying, okay, cool, I'm going to totally do all these things to your character. It's actually asking the person on the receiving end what they're comfortable with in that moment. And they may be comfortable with a lot more than what the other person is actually wanting from that seed, but you get to calibrate those things. And an answer that was not, we explicitly workshopped this, was not acceptable was, I'm up for anything.
Yeah.
And a lot of us tend to default to that, right? Because we don't want to be the person in the room that is ruining the fun for everybody. And younger players, especially, or newer players, may actually just not know what their boundaries are because they've never been in a situation like I just described. So they don't know what they are yet. And so that's why I think actually having these systems in place actually allows them that space to check in and say, am I really okay with this, you know? And also thinking like, stop for 3 seconds. Will you be okay with this tomorrow if this thing happens? Will your partner be okay with this if this thing happens? Having those kinds of thought processes aren't always easy when you're deeply immersed in character.
Yeah, I can totally see that. John?
I think very similar to this. I've seen, I think Stephanie Nudelman came up with a variation of the OK check-in, which is the consent self-check-in, which I think does a lot of things similar to what Sarah is describing. So there's this idea in role-playing, tabletop specifically, I have more experience there, where metagaming is bad, right? Like if you think about things outside the game, somehow you're breaking the rule or doing something wrong. Whereas a lot of these tools that we're talking about, you could think of them as metagame tools, right? They exist outside of the, so like when we were introducing a lot of these tools initially, that was one of the biggest pushbacks. This is a metagame tool, right? So that alone is part of, it's so entrenched in tabletop culture. We just have to keep that in mind when we're trying to move things in other directions. Similar to that, someone might be default to, what would my character do, right? So they're being asked to do something and their first thought would be, well, my character, it would make sense for them to do this. I might not want to do this, but my character would want to do it. So consent self-check-in has, you pause, you ask yourself, do I as a player want to do this? If the answer is no, stop. If the answer is yes, you don't necessarily do it. You then ask yourself, does my character want to do this? Would this be an interesting thing to happen, right? But the first layer is, do I want to do this as a person? And you probably could go even further, right? Like, how does this affect the people around me?
Yeah, definitely. Jax, did you bring your hand up earlier? Or were you just, okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to jump back to the autism thing.
Do it.
Because ADHD and autism are what are called brain cousins, which I think is the cutest thing ever. And it also explains how they react to each other and how they're sort of similar in how they change your brain structure. And my husband is autistic as well. And yes, it is hard to get consent, but it's much harder to even do something if you think you don't have consent, because the rejection sensitive dysphoria in both is strong.
Yeah.
So we're more likely to remain frozen, at least in my experience, than we are to do something without consent. And obviously that's not true for everybody, but I talk about safety tools a lot like a language. Like, this is a language we have all agreed that we are speaking. We agree that this is what this means, this is what this means, and this is how we should respond to this. And that is immensely helpful for people who have one of the brain cousins, because we've all decided that this is the context in which we are operating, and we've all decided that this is what this context means. There's no, I don't want to say there's no nuance, because that's not what I mean, but there's no catch. It feels like there's no catch to it, right? Because we've all agreed that this is what this means. And if somebody is very obviously going, well, yeah, I know we agreed that that's what this means, but I don't want to deal with it, which happens sometimes, then you know that this person is actually misusing that
Mhm.
context. And it's much easier to identify when we've all agreed that, you know, the okay check-in is something we use to make sure everybody is feeling emotionally okay. And somebody decides to, you know, if you put your thumb down or do the hand waggle, somebody decides to go harder on you. Now you know that they are not someone who respects the context we've all agreed on.
Mhm.
And that is a huge benefit to people with ADHD and autism. So, I mean, for me, I find safety tools and safety discussion to be both enjoyably fluid, because I like that, and also, again, we're all agreeing on a similar context. We might not all have the same vision of what safety looks like, but we have an idea of what we want and how to get there.
Yeah, definitely. I can see that. Sarah? You're muted still.
I wanted to piggyback on what John was saying about metagaming.
Mhm.
In Nordic LARP theory, we call it steering, which is a slightly different connotation. So metagaming sounds like cheating to a lot of people. When they hear metagaming, they hear you are using out-of-game knowledge to inform play, your character wouldn't know that, or your character wouldn't do that, etc. And it comes from, if we consider that most gaming came from out of wargaming, which is inherently a competitive medium, then it makes sense that we would be concerned about metagaming, right? It makes sense that we'd be concerned about the rules and playing fair and someone not trying to get out of a consequence because they're, you know, trapped or something like that. So, but there are issues with that in terms of consent, right? In terms of like conflict theory, like if you're always competing, you might really want your goals to be achieved, but you might actually not care about the relationship that much. So consent mechanics give us some other options, even within competitive games. Like, because if we say something like people are more important than LARPs or people are more important than tabletop, then even if you're still trying to win against that other person, ultimately the relationship is actually valued. And so steering is a way of thinking about metagaming that is, we actually do it all the time. Saying don't metagame, humans metagame constantly. We're actually working on a dual consciousness when we're playing. We're in character and out of character, we're steering. We're not always necessarily aware of it, but you know, and that's similar to, you know, don't break my immersion. You know, we slip in and out of immersion all the time. What people are really saying is what it sounds like is, don't make it so I can't win, or don't make it so I can't get the thing that I want. And that's where it gets a little tricky, because ultimately, and especially if you're the kind of person like me that's extremely sensitive. I also have PTSD. I'm often triggered, like, and I need very, very gentle play. Like, I've been told many times, well, maybe this game isn't for you then. And maybe that's true, right? Maybe I shouldn't be at a game where people are just going to constantly push play on me. Maybe that's not actually healthy for me. But is that the fault of them or me or the game itself? Or is it that we just haven't learned the right language yet to make it okay to have those kinds of experiences? So I have had very intense experiences where I've trusted someone enough to go there with them, right? But that's not the default. So steering is a way of thinking about like how you can decide to get into certain kinds of play. Like a really, you know, easy example is like John and I love role playing together. So if he's in a game, I'm probably going to steer over to his character because I know that we're going to have good experiences together, right? That's just human nature. We're going to gravitate towards experiences that we enjoy, right? And so, you know, some people might consider that problematic, you know, or unfair. But like, in my opinion, we're steering all the time towards the things that we enjoy and don't enjoy.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And yeah, like I haven't done a lot of LARP, like LARP isn't my bag because of the anxiety thing. But when I have, it has very much been like, oh, there's my friend Megan in this game. I'm going to go stand next to her. And just we're gonna talk. And oh, can our characters be connected? Yes. Okay, good. Now I feel safe because now I have a buddy. You know, and I have a buddy system, so I know that even if I don't know anybody else here or I get anxious, I can just talk to Megan. And I've done that at a lot of games for the exact same reason. Like, yeah, it's nice to have that, and you probably do it unconsciously, because yeah, if I go into a one-shot LARP at like Midwinter and I only know 4 people in the room, I'm probably going to talk to one of them, as opposed to just like turning to the first stranger I see and being like, hello stranger, let's play games together. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. So unless anybody has any more thoughts on this. No?
I think Shauna was unmuting. Was there something?
Oh, Shauna, were you unmuting?
Oh, good. I'm ready to go on to what's next. I feel like everybody's covered all the things, so perfect.
Well, one thing that we talked about a little bit is I want to talk about overcoming some like challenges from players. Now, granted, we all know there are players out there who are just going to be a bad actor. Like we talked about that in the earlier panel about people who want to sit down and like edgelord the X card and just tap it when you say like butterfly or cafe or cat because they're trying to prove that it's pointless and being a dick. So no, don't worry about those people, because those people you should just say goodbye, like if you're not going to deal with it. But I know that there are some folks that just don't quite get it, but you can tell they want to. So what are the best ways to explain why this is important and why we're incorporating these safety tools without making someone think that we can only play fluffy bunny games? Because that's what I hear all the time. Or like, well, I don't need consent tools because I know my friends and da-da-da-da. But like, you don't know what your friend went through last week. Like, you don't know what your friend went through in childhood, maybe. Like, I don't know. Jax, go ahead.
Something Kiana Shaw said at one point. She runs a lot of Bluebeard's Bride, and I really liked what she had to say about it, which is, if you say no to, I don't know, bugs, but you say yes to body horror, that means that we get to have a lot of fun exploring body horror because you're giving me something that I can work with.
Mm-hmm.
You're not just saying no, you're saying, here's the thing I'm comfortable with. Here's what I want to explore. Let's go with that. And I find that framing it in a way of you're giving something to someone as opposed to you're taking away something from someone can really help.
Definitely.
Yeah, I like that so much. I think one of the, we got a lot of guff for putting out the consent in gaming.
I yelled at a lot of people on your behalf. I yelled at so many people on your behalf.
I have a story about that. I'll wait to that.
And I think one of the problems is the misconception that consent closes things down instead of opening them up.
Right.
And so I often start talking about consent in the idea that you're closing things down instead of, that you're opening things up instead of closing them down. And I think that ties into the, what Jax was just saying in interesting ways. And you see this as well in the sex communities, right? Like most people have really boring sex because they don't know how to talk about sex. And so when you start opening that door to what's cool and interesting in sex, you are opening up the possibilities. You're not closing them down, right? So when you start saying, that's not my thing, but this is my thing, then you're having a much different experience. And I feel that way with gaming too. Like closing at one door does not mean you're closing all doors. It very likely means you're opening up other cool and interesting doors. And so I feel like people who think that we're closing things down haven't actually had it well explained, that like what we're actually doing is saying yes to things that normally we wouldn't be able to even talk about because we're doing it in this safe and cool way. And so I always want to just be like, no, you don't understand, like that we can do such cool things. We can talk about such cool things. We can have such cool experiences because we're all going to say yes to this. And so it doesn't matter if somebody's saying no to spiders because they're saying yes to like this awesome, amazing other thing. And so that's often where I start that conversation. And it's like, I'm someone who is not actually easily triggered, but it's super important to me to make sure that, like, because I have such a broad range, I never ever want to put someone in that space. And so I come from consent in a place of like, I know that I have a really broad table. Let's see what things on the table excite you, and we can go from there.
Yeah, definitely. I'm also one of those people who has very few triggers as far as like in fiction. So like over the past few weeks, I've been watching The Handmaid's Tale. All my friends are like, how are you watching that right now? And I'm like, because it's good. But I can watch it because it's fiction and my brain is able to do that and not everybody can. And I totally get that. And so, yeah, I never want to like put something at the table that will hurt or bother people, even if I'm totally okay with it. So really what a consent checklist is doing, and the way that I like to do it is it's also you're kind of asking like, what kind of content do you want to see? And it gets everybody on the same page. So if you say, what kind of content do you want to see? And everybody's like, body horror. But somebody's like, no spiders. Then exactly, like, cool, then I'm going to write some real creepy ass body horror. And we're going to freak you out. And it's going to be great. I am definitely of the belief that very few games are not for somebody. unless it's just like the entire subject matter is something that you're not cool with. Like if you're not cool with vampires, don't play vampire. But past that, if you're, there's other options out there. Sarah?
Yeah, I've been listening to a lot of people talking about consent. One person that I would recommend is Betty Martin. She spent 20 years of her life studying consent. She has the Wheel of Consent, which is this super fascinating model. She has 8 hours of videos on her website for free, by the way. So like I used to just listen to them while I was commuting, and she's just fascinating. There's so many layers to all of this, right? But one of the things that she talked about, and I've heard in other spaces, is even the act of asking sometimes makes for a person feeling more comfortable saying yes. So, that's not to say, here's the workaround, just ask people and you can extract a yes. But when someone asks, when someone checks in, they are signaling, I care about your comfort, I care about your feelings, and I'm not going to violate you. Now that may, of course, not be the case, but oftentimes, when we're talking about how do we build this culture, the tools are great. They help us in having a shared language. But what's more important than the tools is the agreement that we're all going to value each other's emotions, and we're all going to try to create a space that feels held. And so when we talk about comfort can get a little tricky when talking about consent and talking about gaming too, because a lot of the best experiences happen outside of our comfort zone. Mm-hmm. or when we're pushing our comfort zone. I don't want to say outside of it, but when we're at the edge of it. So ideally we have experiences where we feel safe enough to explore our edges, knowing that if we're a no at some point, then everybody will dial it back because they care about us. Now, again, like that's a perception. That's not necessarily what will literally happen. But the more that we communicate, hey, your feelings matter to me. Is this content okay with you? The more a person might feel more comfortable opening up and saying, you know what, this person checked in on me. Maybe I will trust them just a little bit more. Now, that's not true for everybody. Some people really, really don't like being checked in on. So this is not a one size fits all for people. But at least in my experience, if someone is signaling that they care about my feelings, I'm more likely to trust them.
Yeah, definitely. John?
One thing I've started thinking about, before the pandemic, I used to host a lot of get-togethers in my apartment. And so many people have different food preferences, right? Like the act of trying to cook for 8-10 different people and keeping all of this in mind is quite difficult. And I would say sometimes maybe as or more difficult than some of the things we're talking about. And so like, that's something I've been thinking about as a way to potentially describe some of the nuances, right? Because you might not, your guests might not want certain food or certain ingredients for a wide variety of reasons, right? So they might have an allergy. So it's a hard safety issue. Even an allergy, right? Some people might have an allergy and they might stop breathing. Other people might just feel minorly upset, right? That also varies quite a bit. You have people who don't eat certain things for religious reasons, for ethical reasons, for health reasons, or some people just don't like it, right? And I think all of these things are valid. And so if I'm going to make a group meal for everyone, I would like everyone to have a good time inviting them to my home, right? So it helps me to collect this information in whatever way is convenient to getting the truth from folks. And I don't want to have to read people's minds because I'm going to get it wrong.
Yeah, there's definitely stuff. I mean, that's a great analogy because like there's stuff that I can just not eat or pick around if it's on something, so I don't mention it. Like I don't like bell peppers, but if you serve me something with bell peppers and like a stir fry, I can just pick them out and I'm not going to be upset or hurt by them. But I'm allergic to strawberries, so if you're like, here, have these strawberries, I'm like, I will have hives and I will be very uncomfortable. And if you feed my best friend crab, she'll die. So like, yeah, it's good to know kind of where everybody's boundaries are and like what you need to mention, what you don't, etc. And just to collect all of it and treat it all seriously, no matter what the reason behind it is. Shauna, I see you unmuted.
I'm so fascinated what it says about our culture that it's totally normalized to ask what kinds of foods you would like to eat at an event. And it's not totally normal to ask what kind of experiences you would like to have at the table.
Right?
It's absolutely cultural that one thing is common and expected and frowned upon, even if you don't at least ask. And the other is a thing that we're having to teach people and tiptoe around and deal with, sort of negative feedback from. And it's like when you zoom out and sort of look at it, I'm just fascinated by that. It's really so easy when you put it in the food description kind of experience.
Yeah. Jax?
So I want to tell my story about Shauna's consent in gaming forum here, because this is one of my favorite stories to tell in safety panels. As I mentioned very early on, I'm the English proofreader and editor for Cult Divinity Lost. And so I'm in a lot of the cult groups. I've had to jump out of several of them for edgelord reasons. But one of the things I remember most is when consent in gaming came out, there were so many people stating that this would ruin cult, this would be terrible, this would destroy their gaming experience. I'm like, this isn't even for cult, but okay, way to make it about you. Someone decided to write his own Google Doc rewriting consent in gaming. And it was not great. But there was this page of things you should include in your horror game, and it included stuff like haunted castles and piles of dead babies. And I was like,
those are very different boundaries.
Yeah. And I was like, hey, wait, hold on a sec. Do you honestly think Shauna Germain is trying to stop you from using haunted castles and dead babies? He's like, yeah, that's what that's about. Because if you're telling me no, you're restricting my creativity. Then I had a galaxy brain moment, as so often happens with ADHD. It's very strongly tied to the geek social fallacies, if you're familiar with the 5 geek social fallacies. Because there's 2 in particular, which is friends support me in everything I do, and ostracizers are evil. And the idea that somebody might say no to you at your table, how could they? They are clearly not your friend. They want to restrict your creativity. People aren't used to being told no, even also not used to being told yes in nerd spaces, because there's a certain expected, amount of immersion that you're supposed to have, whether it's D&D or anything else. And this idea that somebody might be able to tell you no, even if all of our consent is geared towards gifting, which I personally think it is, but that also leaves open the option of somebody might say no instead of yes. And that's terrifying for a lot of people. And I think, the way I explained it was, look, 1 in 4 women aren't subjected to haunted castles. Like 66, God, how many? It's like 6 million or 66 million children in the US aren't subjected to haunted castles. Like, we're not trying to take away your fun, and we're not trying to tell you that you're not our friend. But in a lot of ways, this geek social fallacy of, if you tell me no, you are ostracizing me and you are trying to shut me down and tell me you're not my friend, runs really deep in a lot of people. And with the food analogy, it's not about the person making the food. It's about the person who's ingesting and taking, I don't fucking know what word my brain was trying to use there. I'm sorry, I swore. But like, it's about what will happen to your body if something goes into your body that your body can't handle. And people understand that because it's very physical, right? It's very, for lack of a better word, embodied. But with stuff like consent, or even more specifically, Shauna's consent in gaming, it's not. And then it more becomes about, people think it becomes about the social dynamic. And do you really like me? Are you just tolerating me? Do you just play games with me to be nice to me? Do you not actually like my player GMing style? Because that's part of me. Oh, if you don't like my play style, then clearly you don't like me. And it gets into this whole sort of cavalcade of assumptions and like walls we have up to avoid rejection even. So that's why I started this with, safety tools are a gift. Consent culture is a gift because it's telling you what everybody wants to do.
Mhm.
And that reframe is so important, because it's not, no, I'm not your friend. It's not that I'm not your friend. In fact, I want to be your friend, and I want to be your friend, and I want to share these things with you.
Yeah.
So.
No, definitely. Someone in the chat earlier said that they discovered after their players filled out the consent form that they had been holding back, and they had a lot more options for content, because they were like, oh, I was trying to be so respectful. And everybody was like, no, we're fine with that. Yeah. Which I've definitely seen happen before too. We are in the last 15 minutes or so, although, like I said, we can go a little bit over, but I don't want to keep everybody here until 7. But we have a few questions popping in, so I'm going to let folks ask their questions if they need to, and then we'll kind of put a pin on it at the very end. So Erica asked a therapy RPG question. Can anyone speak about ways that players can use consent for growth? Sarah, you're like ready for that.
I'm writing a book on this right now. So
oh, well, then I think Sarah could probably speak about it.
It's very much on my mind because, you know, there's all sorts of layers to even what therapy is, first of all. So, you know, somebody may be a therapist running a game that's for social skills, not for therapeutic purposes. And that is a slightly different animal in a lot of ways. But if you're talking about therapy, you are talking about growth. And what does growth mean? Well, we grow all the time, but it's an intentionality. And it's a very intentionally held space where certain types of processing are normalized. So it's not just about checking in with somebody iteratively, because that's very much a part of it, but it's also about whenever getting close to certain content that might be close to trauma or close to something that needs to be processed that feels stuck, because growth is about moving past, right? Or working with and moving on rather than being stuck. Whenever we get close to that content, being able to actually unpack it and process it. And I would say that's a very strong distinction from what we do in most leisure games. I would like to see more leisure games have some sort of active processing, whether it's debriefing or just normalizing of after game, me coming up to one of you and saying, wow, something just came up for me. Do you mind if I unpack it with you? And those moments can be really, really powerful. But in terms of therapy, it's an intentionally held container where both parties have agreed ahead of time what their goals are. And they've also agreed where they're not going to go. So you might be running a table for, you know, sexual abuse survivors, but it's very explicitly said, we're not going to go there in this game. Just because everybody here shares that background doesn't mean that's going to be the content of this game. In fact, we're going to put that on the X card list. So, you know, just because something's for therapy doesn't mean you want to go straight to that thing. As a matter of fact, there needs to be so much checking in and so much agreement, and really some fictional distancing is likely to help a lot depending on the setting. And, you know, most of the therapists that I'm hearing from some of them just don't go there at all. And others go there very, very, very conscientiously and with that processing and that built-in time that, you know, afterwards you're going to be able to unpack it. So yes, a lot of the growth are in those uncomfortable places, but like Jax was saying, like, we don't want to exposure therapy people and just force them into situations that make them uncomfortable, because we know that's where their trigger is. So it's a difficult balancing act for sure.
Jax, do you have something?
Yeah, fictional distancing is one of my favorite things in games, because Changeling the Lost, game that saved my life. Something that is so important to me about Changeling is that while it is a game about people who are abducted by otherworldly entities and come back irrevocably changed, it is the closest thing to my own personal trauma that I have ever found in gaming, with Bluebeard's Bride coming in a very close second. And this sort of almost therapeutic magical thinking in games, I think, is incredibly valuable from a therapeutic perspective, because a lot of times trauma and traumatic memories and what my friend Clementine Morrigan refers to as traumatic time traveling, like you hypervigilance into the future, or you flash back into the past. Often it feels alien and strange and magical in a way. And having games that have that sort of magical sense to them, I think, have a huge therapeutic property, because you can't just have, like, if you do decide to, for example, cover sexual assault survivors in a game, say you do decide to cover that at your table and that is what you're choosing to cover, having a game where someone gets sexually assaulted or is under threat of sexual assault over and over again is not fun and it's not therapeutic. But having a game where you're dealing with entities who might violate your mind, body, or spirit, and who you are dealing with this almost non-consensual, like non-consensual in the fiction, consensual in the gaming space, but almost non-consensual contract with, i.e. the True Fae in Changeling the Lost, there's a huge therapeutic benefit to that because now you're sort of experiencing not what actually happened, but what felt like it happened. And that's how you can start to unpack feelings around those things.
Definitely. Anybody else have anything to add to that?
I was just going to add that my most recent book is called We Are All Mad Here, and it's a compilation of fairy tales and mental health. And part of the reason that I created it was actually to give people an opportunity to explore characters who live with mental health concerns or mental illness in a safe way that is not actually therapeutic. Although people could use it for that. The conversation around that is how to get empathy, how to maybe explore other experiences, how to sort of see that in a weird way because it's fairy tale, but how to see that as a very human experience. And so my background is that I have a psych degree with a specialization in post-traumatic stress. I was a firefighter and a paramedic. And so I brought a lot of those into that. But one of the things that I think is really fascinating is talking about like mental health without it being gamified. And I think that's part of consent too, because there's a lot of mental health gamification that happens. And it doesn't often allow for consent of what your character is experiencing through that mental health space. And so I'm very happy to see things like Bluebeard's Bride and other new places where you are consenting to have this very difficult mental experience. And it's done with all these safety tools in place. And I think that's a really great direction that we're sort of moving forward into.
Definitely. John, anything to add, or are you good on this one? Okay. Menachem also asks that when using games for therapeutic and spiritual work, we need to have space for people to explore kind of whatever comes up. So can you speak to balancing using games this way and also with consent and safety? Jax, you're always like ready. I love it.
Sorry, this is just from personal experience.
Yeah,
I've had people at my table who tried to use games as therapy without my personal consent, and that gets real awkward real fast. Please be sure that the group you are playing with, everybody in the group understands that's what's going on, and everybody is very clear on that is the objective of this game.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I used to play this alternate history game that a friend of mine ran. It was a lot of fun. And something I expressed to all of the other players is, look, something I want to work through is this issue I have with my mom, and I want the GM to play my character's mom as emotionally abusive. And this was fine with all of them because they knew I was having this issue, especially because I had just moved out of my parents' house and they were not happy about that. But it was a space that allowed us to deal with these issues because I was very, very, very clear at the beginning of the game. This is why I want to have this character's relationship be this way. And you got to be clear about that. You got to be clear about what you're trying to explore, and you got to be clear about what you're trying to achieve. Like Sarah was talking about steering earlier. You need a lot of freaking steering in order to make sure a game where you're trying to explore whatever comes up can do so in a safe and productive manner.
Mm-hmm. Sarah?
Yeah, one of the concerns that I often hear is, and this is a little bit straying from your question, I'm sorry, Menachem, but is I don't want people using this game for therapy. And a lot of times people have had experiences where other players have emoted on them or like fallen apart, or they've felt like emotionally responsible somehow, and they hadn't consented to that agreement. Now, again, if we're kind of starting from this notion of players are more important than games, then maybe we do have a responsibility to take care of somebody in those situations. But if it's clear that someone else is not trying to self-regulate and has not actually, like I'm playing fluffy bunnies and you're over here playing this, and this is actually not what we agreed towards, then that can feel non-consensual to the person that's now forced to do processing with you. So I very much agree that it's important to have consent and make the intention of the game space itself clear. But I also want to stress that therapeutic impacts just sometimes happen. We might be like walking into Fluffy Bunnies and think, oh, this is going to be a silly game. And then, you know, some sort of childhood trauma around the loss of an animal comes up and then boom, you're crying, you know, so what do you do then? And that's when it's really helpful to have people that you feel safe with, that you can like check in with. You have tools to be able to say, I need to leave the space. Or if you have people that are skilled at, or at least willing to do processing with that person. So if somebody can pull them aside and, you know, obviously it would be ideal to have somebody with training of some sort to do that, but no, we don't always have that, right? So having somebody like Shauna said, that's empathetic, that's willing to listen, that's willing to take some time out of their game to actually help move through whatever's coming up can be really helpful. But it shouldn't be an expectation if that isn't what's set in the or role play space.
Definitely. Yeah. I think this is probably speaking to some of the folks who are here for the actual therapy portion of this, which is why like they are using this for that on purpose. And so it's just a matter of like, if you have a group and, you know, one person's trying to work through something, but maybe that's somebody else's like X card. How would you handle that? Shauna?
Yeah, we have, so in the before times when we hosted a lot of games, but in real life,
right?
The first things that we do is introduce the people that come to the spaces in our house as safe spaces. And so if you need to leave the table, you have a room that is yours to go to, where you can close the door and be alone. You can, you know, we also make sure people, you know that that's okay for any reason at all. And we sort of try to really normalize it. Like if you need to take a phone call, if you need to work out some issues, and the space has like a journal that, you know, pages of paper and a pen, just in case, like whatever, you know, tissues, whatever the thing is that makes that your space. And so that's sort of the first thing that we do in person is create a space where you can leave the table if you need to and walk away. We also do check-ins before and after every game. And these are, I think, invaluable to talking about the experience. And of course, it gets easier the more that a game goes on with the same group. But we try to make sure that people have the time and space without feeling hurried to talk about things as they kind of go. And of course, now that has kind of moved to Slack because we're doing not in-person games anymore. And so we do a check-in on Zoom, and then after that, we often do a check-in on Slack. We encourage people to keep journals. I think that journals are really smart because, you know, sometimes you walk away from a game and you're like, I'm feeling weird. Like, what happened? And you don't know. And so even if you had a conversation, like I take a long time to process things. So if I had a conversation right after a game about why I felt weird, I would be all off. I wouldn't have it correct. And so keeping a journal after allows me to figure that out. And the last one is campfire moments, where your characters are actually in the game together. There's nothing happening. It gives you an opportunity to sort of sit around and talk in character about the things that are happening. And I think that keeping the distinction between sort of the sort of player check in and check out at the end and the in-character campfire moments helps us also with things like bleed and making sure that even our characters feel okay about what's happening as well. So those are the things that we typically use to help make that space.
Yeah, definitely. Like it is interesting when you have that weird feeling after a game and you don't realize what it is. It took me 3 sessions of our B5 game that we're in right now to realize that I was annoyed because our storyteller was giving me all the women NPCs to talk to, and I'm the only woman player, and he wasn't doing it on purpose. It was a total, like, just, I'm playing a very classy, elegant person, and he was putting people that he perceived as classy and elegant in my space, and they happened to be women. And I kind of was like, hey, can you stop that? And he immediately, like, next session was like, oh, here's some power players. And I'm like, thank you. Like I don't need to just talk to women, and, like, sad women, too. A lot of them were sad women. And I was like, my character has no patience for sad women. Like, that's not who she is. So they come to her and are like, can you help me? And she's like, no, go, you're annoying me. So yeah, so we have fixed that now. But it is something that, like, I felt weird for like 3 sessions. I was like, what? I can't put my finger on what's weird about this game to me. Like, what is it? And I was like, oh, biases that you don't realize you have. So we don't have any other questions in the little question thing right now, and then in the Q&A. So one of the questions from our initial email chain was kind of, what are we thinking, where's this conversation going to go as we look towards the future? So I kind of want to end on that note. Like, where do we think, I mean, this is something that, like, I never thought about 5 years ago. I thought about a lot in the past 5 years as I got really into the gaming community. And now I can't imagine not thinking about this for a game. So where do we hope that goes maybe 5 years from now? Go ahead, Sarah.
So this is sort of piggybacking off the therapy question, but I've been very interested in, like, not tearing down alibi, but in acknowledging that it's a polite fiction and that we bring a lot of that everything that we're experiencing in games is a part of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a really edgy thing for people. A lot of people are absolutely not comfortable acknowledging that because it takes away that safety of not having responsibility. But I think that a lot of growth and a lot of self-awareness and a lot of training of certain skills that might be helpful in life, that happens in that space where we're able to acknowledge that there's a transfer between me and my character and me. So, you know, in a lot of communities, still to this day, when they hear the word bleed, they think that is a negative thing. Like, that is something to be avoided, you know, and they hear the word alibi. They're like, yeah, I'm an alibi player. You know, like, and that's okay. Like, I'm not saying that everyone has to play this way, but I think the rise of so many therapists that are saying, wow, this is clearly beneficial and I can totally use this, you know, in my practice, is a testament to the fact that there is a lot of potential for that. And the more that we can lean into that and create spaces that feel safer, whether it's in leisure play or in professional settings or in therapeutic settings, the more that we can actually maximize the potential of this format.
Yeah, I was fully an adult before I realized that playing attractive, capable characters in games was making my self-esteem issues a little better, because I had terrible self-esteem growing up. And, like, once I was playing these, you know, like I said, hot, badass women, I felt more like one here and there. And, like, it didn't fix it. It didn't fix me, but, like, it helped. It really did. And that was some good bleed on my part, personally. Yeah, Sarah?
I just wanted to add to that real quick is that what we do after that point, right? Like, having the experience of, wow, I played this really confident, sexy woman in this game, but that's not who I really am, right? Like, how do we make that transfer more explicit? And that's the space that I'm really interested in.
Definitely. John?
I think what I'd love to see in 5 years is more games where these tools, procedures aren't things that are just tacked on, but actually part of the game in a way that makes sense for whatever that game experience is that is being designed for. So that would be one. The second thing is I'd love to see more tools or procedures that are designed by a wide variety of people. So, for example, debriefs are useful for certain folks. Other folks might need much more time to process than they can't process in like 10 minutes right after a game and then go and answer all these questions where they self-reflect. So if, you know, what does a tool for debriefing look like that that is for someone who needs like 24 hours to process or longer, right? Like we mentioned journals, you know, Sarah mentioned having people that you ask their permission to talk through these things with at a later point in time. There's all of these different possibilities. And I think I would both like to move away from tack things on into a game and rather bake it into the game, and move away from the idea that these tools are like monoliths, right? There's one way to do this thing. I think that people have different needs, and I think we should provide for those different needs.
Like I have never touched an X card, but I have definitely filled out consent forms, which were very helpful. And that's great. Like, everyone's got different things they need. Jax, go ahead.
I totally agree with John here, especially about the everybody needs different things. There's a lot of non-neurotypical people who play games and a lot of people who are neurotypical in different ways. And like, I've seen people be like, oh, well, you used that safety tool wrong because you didn't tell me in the moment that you felt bad. You only realized afterwards you felt bad, and that's a problem. That's your problem. And I'd like to see a discussion of like when you feel unsafe using a safety tool, or, you know, I'd like to see more discussion of safety tools as tools and less as a you slap it down on your table and now it's safe. Because if they're tools, if you have somebody who's using a hammer to build a chair and you have somebody who's using a hammer to beat people with, it's still the same hammer.
Mm-hmm.
But like, one is very clearly more harmful than the other. And I'd like to see more discussion of that, especially because a lot of the discussion that I've seen around that either tends to be safety tools are the end-all be-all, or safety tools are useless because they're a Band-Aid. And I need more nuance in the discussion, please.
Honestly, I think that most of my Twitter opinions over the past 3 years could be boiled down to I wish we had more nuance on this. That's where all of my opinions lie. It's like I wish nuance existed on the internet, but it doesn't now. Unless you write like a 30-thread long thing, and even then, somebody will take that one quote out of context and be like, "Look at the thing they said," and it's like, "No, fine, go away." Shauna?
I think that in 5 years, I would like to see a two-pronged approach. And the first one is, of course, the people who are already at the forefront of this continuing to make progress, the kind of progress that we're already talking about, right? Like what happens next. The other prong of this approach is I would really like to see normalizing consent across the board.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, it's like there is kind of a silo happening where people who care about consent are involved and they're learning it and they're engaging with it. And then there's sort of this exterior of people who are just very anti-consent, which is a thing that we see sort of kind of everywhere, right? And so what I would really like is to find ways to make that bridge. How do we get tables to be safe? Because everyone understands inherently the importance of consent. And I think we do that partly by engaging children so that kids, young players can kind of come up in an age of consent, come up with games like that. And then finding ways to communicate the importance of consent. Again, the things we talked about, we're not trying to take control. We're not trying to take away your castles, right? We're not like, and make it, find a way to engage the people who, we need to get them to create a safe space too, because no one's safe until everybody's on board with consent. And so if we could have progress on both of those prongs in 5 years, I would be super happy.
Yeah, definitely. One thing that I know that I just as a person have been working on is like listening to boundaries for people, because I'm very good at respecting certain boundaries. Obviously, most people are. Like, I'm good at respecting sexual boundaries. I'm good at respecting boundaries about certain topics. However, there's so many little things that are baked into our culture that we were talking about earlier, like saying like, "Oh, hey, do you want to go out later?" And someone's like, "Nah, not really feeling." I'm like, "Come on, are you sure?" And like just taking that no the first time, because you don't know why. Like, you don't know if they're in pain. You don't know if they're sick. You don't know if they're trying to quit drinking. You don't know if they just need to get up early in the morning for like a medical thing that's actually scary. And like, you don't want to pry into that. And that's really important. One of my exes was a recovering alcoholic. And the amount of times we'd go to a bar, because he was fine going to bars to socialize, the amount of times we would go and people would try to like force drinks onto him was ridiculous. And he was like, "No, I literally can't drink. Like, I will backslide. This is not good for me." And people would still like try to like, haha, wouldn't it be funny if we gave him like a spiked drink? And like, no, it's not. But because he was a man, they were a little bit less weird about it. And so practicing consent in like what seems like a small thing, I think is a really good way to get used to practicing it all the time. Yes, John?
I just wanted to add to that. I'm vegan, and I've had many people try to make me eat meat, which is very strange.
That's so weird.
Yeah, it just shows how casual these things are, right? Where I don't think people are even thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's the one I am guiltiest of is definitely the like, "Are you sure? Come on, it'd be fun, just for a little bit," like because I want to hang out with that person, and therefore I'm putting my selfishness above their wishes, and that's not okay. Sarah?
Yeah, and I think also there's this sense that that's where the fun is. So the person is just too scared to have fun. And so if they just had the right support, then they would be where the fun is. And that it's a fundamental misunderstanding of the consent in a lot of ways. It's not necessarily malignant. It's just, and I've certainly been that person. I've been the provocateur before.
Mm-hmm.
Or come on. You know, like I feel like I have to push those edges.
I'm an extrovert. Like I'm always the one who's like, let's go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I've had to really learn how to dial that back and to really pay attention and stay attuned to people. And it's still a process, you know. It will be a lifelong process. It's not like you know get your master's degree in consent and you're done, right? Like it's something that we figure out as we go. And part of it, though, is like unpacking these cultural tendencies that we don't even necessarily think twice about, and then say, whoa, wait a minute, that is like fundamentally a non-consensual activity that is normalized. And like, for example, drinking before having sex. Like, I think it was actually John, the first person who really told me that that's not okay, like, unless it's a, you know, very clear consent space where both people have agreed ahead of time and there's a long-term partnership. Like I did not realize, because it's so baked into culture, that intoxication makes it so a person cannot consent until, you know, just a few years ago, because it was just so much of what you do. You go out, you get loaded, you have sex, right? Like that's, you know, and people, again, just like, are you taking my castle away? It's like, are you invalidating my entire sexual history? Are you telling me that I'm a rapist? Are you, you know what I mean? So it's very easy to get threatened by that kind of thing. And it's like, hey, we're all learning here. We're all trying to figure this stuff out. So I think there is a little bit of gentleness needed, and as we're working through it.
I'm so glad
Go ahead.
So glad I was able to introduce everybody to the haunted castles and dead babies theory of consent.
Yeah, it's a good line. Trying to ask you about 5 minutes. I want to ask one last question that we're going to try to answer real quick, and then we're going to wrap this up, which is, what do you do if there's an unintentional breach or overstep? Like, how do you repair that, or what do you do in the moment? Like I spoke to a minute ago when my friend was like, I stuff. I was like, didn't happen. We'll never mention it again, and try to make that very explicit. But past that, what are other tools anybody else has? Yes, Jax.
Don't over apologize, and have someone whose job it is to handle missteps. Like, even if it's not the same person for everyone, that's fine. But having someone you can go to and be like, hey, I think I fucked up with this person. Can you help me? Because if you're unintentionally stepping on someone's toes, especially if you have especially if you're neuroatypical and you, in the way that you have rejection sensitive dysphoria, it can be a huge struggle to be like, oh my God, I fucked someone up. I feel so bad. And having someone to process with who isn't the person you stepped on is really important. And I think that kind of gets lost because, oh my God, I hurt you. I'm so sorry. Let me take out my grief of hurting you on you, because this is what you want to hear. You want to hear how sorry I am, etc., etc. And if you've ever seen the ring theory of care, it's care in, dump out. And that is honestly the best way to do it. Just care for the person you accidentally stepped on, and then deal with your feelings with a buddy.
Yep. I've done a lot of training with like the LGBTQ community and gender stuff, because that's what my activism has been in since I was 14. And so like, that's what we always tell people if you misgender somebody by accident. Is like, as far as that person is concerned, correct yourself, move on, never happened. If you're gonna be, if you want to be in your feelings about it, like, I can go talk to my boyfriend and be like, I feel like such an asshole, I misgendered them, I'm so good about that usually, I feel, you know, and like, go ahead, have those feelings, but don't have them at the person that you have wronged. Anybody else have anything to add on to that, or is that a good enough answer for this one?
I'm going to harp on communication, because communication.
Yes.
Communication. That's I think the answer to everything, and it's so freaking hard. but I think that you know, that's where we come down to right there.
Sarah, do you have like one last little point? You're like a hand.
Yeah, just in terms of like, what do we do as facilitators? What do we do as designers? Like, John and I have worked a lot on creating internal processes for what to do if someone gets triggered, or what to do if someone's boundary gets crossed, and what not to do, and having those be very explicit, and have people have training around them. So even if they're just a volunteer, they're not a psychologist or anything like that, but you know, just how do we hold the container of this gaming space, so that when inevitably something happens, it's not if, it's when something happens, we can be responsive in a way that isn't going to do more harm. And there's no way to guarantee that, right? Like, but you're at least, actually we role played out certain scenarios. So actually having the physical embodiment of it rather than just have it be theoretical is pretty important.
Definitely. I know Shauna has to run, so if you want to tell them real quick where people can find you, if they want to talk to you on Twitter, what have you.
No, it's Shauna Germain. I'm under my name and everything just to make it super easy. Thank you guys. This has been the most amazing panel, and I loved hearing everything you had to say. Thank you for coming to listen. I have to run. It was lovely
Thank you
to see
so
all.
much. I'm so glad you made it through the storm. Bye. Okay. I was like, oh, it's time. She has to go. So yeah, so let's just go around and kind of do the final, where people find you, follow you, talk to you. Sarah?
SarahLynneBowman.com is my website, and I'm on Facebook. I'm an old person, so Facebook is this, apparently where middle-aged people are these days.
Yeah, I have to deal with the fact that I am officially middle-aged pretty much now.
But you do Twitter, which I never got into, so I feel like I'm more so.
We have an interesting tiny generation gap where we're all very similar generations on this panel, but we're all just one notch apart from each other. Because I just turned 35, so I'm in that elder millennial kind of situation. John, where can people find you and follow you if they want to talk to you about this stuff further or other things? Maybe veganism, who knows, whatever.
Sounds great. So I think the easiest place would be Twitter as far as direct messages. And you can find me at JSTAV_.
Easy enough. Jax?
Hello, it is I, the baby of the panel at 28. But you can find me on most social media as Rufflejax. That's RUFFLEJAX. Again, that's RUFFLEJAX. You can also find me on my website at jacquelinebrick.design. And I have a link tree that links to all of my websites, which is just Linktree Rufflejax. If you know how the trees look, I'll put it in I'm actually going to go ahead and put it in the chat.
Go for it.
Because it's hard to sound out a Linktree link. But
when I download the recording, I can also do the chat, so we can maybe put it up next to the video or something.
Cool. But yeah, I yell a lot on social media about horror and trauma and healing, so feel free to come follow along.
Awesome. If anyone wants to talk to me, I have my Twitter handle right there. I'm Dixie Cyanide on most social media. That's also my Facebook / whatever, but don't from me if you don't know me, because I'm weird about that. But yeah, so Dixie Cyanide, that's me. DixieCochran.com if you want to hire me, but that's not what this is for. But thank you to everyone at Padana Group. This is so awesome. We have a bunch more panels tomorrow. We have some panels tonight. I'm really looking forward to the 9 p.m. Gehenna Gaming, how to do horror for diverse audiences. I'm going to talk about how to dial it up, dial it down, depending on your table. So it's probably going to build off of some of what we've been talking about. And the Gehenna Gaming people are excellent at that. As their consent form is something 4 pages long, because they do deal with horror games exclusively. So it's literally everything you could think of to be in a horror game is on there. And so I love talking to them about that stuff. So tune into that at 9. There's other panels. Thank you all for sticking around a little bit late. I know folks had other panels to get to, but we were having a great conversation. So thank you, Sarah. Thank you, John. Thank you, Jax. And thank you, everybody who attended. This was a lot of fun.
And thank you so much for moderating.
Thanks. I host a podcast. This is fun for me. I can just sit back and listen to the people who have way more knowledge about this. But yes, of course, this has been great. I love meeting all of you virtually. So thank you. I'm going to end this recording now and then stop the call.